Hello, and welcome to Introduction to Psychology. This presentation will conclude our look at social psychology. The presentation will focus on social influences, that is, the various ways in which the social situation or the people around us can affect our behaviour. One social influence is social role-playing. Social role-playing is adopting the patterns of behaviour expected of a person in a particular guise. It is playing the part of or acting like a particular type of person. For example, while away at college, a person might act like a grown-up. They might study hard, work part-time, and do all of their own cooking and cleaning. However, when visiting home, the same person might act like a child. They might not do any work and accept having their washing and cooking done for them by their parents. Social role-playing illustrates the power that social situations have over us. The classic study of social role-playing was the Stanford Prison Experiment, Zimbardo 1973. Zimbardo converted a basement at Stanford University into a fake prison. He then recruited 24 participants and randomly assigned them to be either prisoners or guards. Prisoners were arrested, booked, issued with prison clothing, and only referred to by their prison ID numbers. Guards were given uniforms, whistles, and clubs, and wore sunglasses to prevent direct eye contact. Very quickly, the guards became aggressive and assertive, while the prisoners became submissive and dependent. The experiment was originally intended to last 2 weeks, but it was stopped after 6 days due to the excessive aggression of the guards and the serious emotional breakdown of the prisoners. The experiment was a powerful illustration of how sometimes people's behavior has little to do with their personalities, but much to do with the situation in which they are placed. A second social influence is conformity. Conformity involves changing one's behavior, attitude, or belief in response to group pressure. That is, copying the actions performed or the beliefs expressed by the people around you. Conformative can be positive, negative, or neutral. For example, if a person copies her friends by donating to charity, then this is positive because it benefits society. If a person copies his friends by shoplifting, then this is negative because it harms society. If a person copies his colleagues by wearing jeans to work, then this is neutral because it doesn't have any effect on society. There are 2 types of conformity. Sometimes people copy the behavior of the group because they want to be right. That is, they copy the group because they think that the group knows better than they do. For example, if a student was unsure of the answer to a question asked in class, then they might raise their hand when everyone else does because they assume that the other students are correct. Or if a tourist was unsure how to navigate a strange transit system, then they might follow the locals because they assume that the locals know where they are going. This is known as informational conformity. Sometimes people copy behavior of the group because they want to be liked. That is, sometimes people copy what everyone else does so that they won't be the odd one out. For example, a girl might choose to wear the same style of clothes as her friends because she wants to fit in. This is known as normative conformity. Normative influence causes people to go along with the group despite not actually agreeing with them. It should be noted that social norms are expected patterns of behavior established by groups. For example, one clique, one group of friends, might expect all members to be cheerful and wear bright clothes, while another clique might expect all group members to be morose and wear dark colours. Individuals who deviate from social norms risk being ostracized. That is, they risk being excluded from the group. A third social influence is compliance. Compliance is defined as a change in behavior made in response to a request. A request is an appeal made by one person to another, where the person making the appeal is of equal or lower status to the person receiving the appeal. That is, it is an appeal made by a person who is not in a position of authority. For example, a worker asking their boss for a raise, or a student asking their housemate to tidy up. There are numerous tactics that make it more likely that a person will agree to a request. These are known as compliance techniques. The foot in the door technique involves getting someone to go along with a small request before making the request slightly larger. It is leading people up to things in baby steps. For example, first getting someone to sign a petition in favor of a charity, a small request, and then asking them for a donation to the charity, a slightly larger request. The technique's effectiveness relies on people's desire to be logically consistent. According to cognitive dissonance theory, people feel emotional distress if their beliefs, attitudes, or actions do not logically follow from one another. So, if a person engages in a behavior, then they become motivated to try to keep all subsequent behaviors logically consistent with that initial action. Thus, a person who has signed a petition indicated that they are in favor of a charity would be motivated to donate because to do otherwise would be logically inconsistent. The door in the face technique involves making an unreasonably large request, which is likely to be refused, and then reducing one's demands. For example, asking someone for a $100 donation to charity, and when this is refused, asking them for just $5 instead. The technique tends to succeed because appearing to compromise with others puts pressure on them to compromise with you. This is because in general, people are brought up to believe that one good turn deserves another. This is known as the norm of reciprocity. The technique also tends to succeed due to the contrast effect. That is, the first large request makes the second small request seem very reasonable in comparison. The doing favors technique involves doing something for someone else before asking them to do something for you. For example, vacuuming a housemate's room before asking them to take out the trash. The tactic tends to succeed because doing things for others puts pressure on them to do things for you. This is because in general, people are brought up to believe that one good turn deserves another. This is known as the norm of reciprocity. If we don't return the favors that people do us, then we risk social disapproval. The tactic of doing favors plays on this sense of obligation. A fourth social influence is obedience. Obedience is a change in behavior made in response to an order. Orders are commands that are given by a person who is in authority. That is, someone who is of higher status to the person receiving the command. Obedience is mostly beneficial. It facilitates group functioning. For example, emergency services operate much more efficiently if every member of the team does exactly what they are told when they are told to do it. However, in certain circumstances, obedience can be harmful. For example, during the Second World War, Adolf Eichmann was the man directly responsible for organizing the logistics of the final solution. The final solution was the name given to the mass extermination of Jews, Slavs, Poles, Gypsies, African Asians, and homosexuals. At the end of the Second World War, Eichmann escaped to Argentina. However, in 1961, he was captured by Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, and put on trial for war crimes. During his trial, the defense that he offered for his appalling acts was that he was just following orders. This led to a lot of research into the question of what kind of people would just follow orders, even if it meant harming others. The most famous studies carried out into this question were carried out by Stanley Milgram in 1963, 1965, and 1974. He came up with the disturbing conclusion that the majority of people would obey orders to harm another person. The basic paradigm for the Milgram studies was as follows. Volunteers were recruited for a controlled experiment ostensibly investigating learning. At the beginning of the experiment, they were introduced to another participant who was a confederate of the experimenter. They drew straws to determine their roles as either learners or teachers. However, this was fixed, and the confederate was always the learner, while the participants were always the teacher. There was also an experimenter dressed in a grey lab coat, played by an actor. 2 rooms were used for the experiment. One room was for the learner, which contained an electric chair, and the other room was for the teacher and experimenter, which contained an electric shock generator. The learner was strapped to the chair and connected to electrodes. After the learner had studied a list of word pairs, the teacher tested him by naming a word and asking the learner to recall its partner word. The learner was given a list of 4 possible answers to choose from. The teacher was told to administer an electric shock every time the learner made a mistake, increasing the shock level each time. There were 30 switches on the shock generator, marked from 15 volts slight shock to 450 volts danger severe shock. The learner deliberately gave mainly wrong answers, and for each of these, the teacher gave him an electric shock. If the teacher refused to administer a shock, the experimenter gave a series of orders and prods to ensure that they continued. Of course, the teachers were not actually delivering electric shocks. The experiment was faked, but the volunteers did not know this at the time and were only told at the end of the study. The results of Milgram's initial studies revealed that 65% of participants delivered the ultimate punishment of 450 volts. All of the participants delivered a shock of at least 300 volts. All of the participants showed signs of tension and stress, sweating, stuttering, and/or biting their lips. And all participants paused the procedure at least once to voice concern. After Milgram's original 1963 study, numerous other experiments were carried out, both by Milgram and others, to investigate what factors influence people's propensity to obey commands. The first of these factors is socialization, that is, how people are brought up. The more you have been raised to do as you are told, the more likely you are to obey without thinking. The degree to which people learn to obey authority varies from nation to nation. Spanish people are highly obedient. 90% of people shocked to the 450 volt limit in a replication of Milgram's study conducted in 1986. Australian people show low levels of obedience. Only 40% of people shocked to the 450 volt limit in a replication of Milgram's study conducted in 1974. A second factor that moderates obedience is the way in which obedience is induced. The most effective technique for inducing obedience is to escalate commands gradually. This is what happens in the Milgram studies. That is, to begin with a command to do something minor, and then, once that command has been obeyed, follow it up with a slightly larger command. This is essentially the same as the foot in the door technique of compliance explained in previous slides. The least efficient way to induce obedience is to start out with a command to do something large without any preliminary orders. A third factor that influences obedience is the proximity of authority. That is, how close the person giving the order is to the person receiving the order. Obedience is highest when the person giving the orders is physically present in the same space as the person receiving the orders. Obedience decreases if the person giving orders is not physically present, for example, if they are issuing commands by the phone or via email. A fourth factor that influences obedience is the power of the authority figure. The more power an authority figure has, the more likely they are to be obeyed. There are several types of power that individuals can have. The first is reward power. The more capacity an authority figure has to issue rewards, the more likely they are to be obeyed. The second is coercive power. The more capacity an authority figure has to issue punishments, the more likely they are to be obeyed. The third is legitimacy power. The more recognized, accepted, or acknowledged an authority figure is, the more likely they are to be obeyed. The fourth is referent power. The more liked and admired an authority figure is, the more likely they are to be obeyed. And the fifth is expert power. The higher the authority figure's skill and ability, the more likely they are to be obeyed. You might like to consider how police officers differ from security guards on these factors. Think about why you would be likely to obey one more than the other. A fifth factor that influences obedience is social support. People are less likely to follow orders if they see other people being disobedient, and they are more likely to follow orders if they see others being obedient. In a variation of the original Milgram study, carried out in 1974, participants either saw another person refusing to complete the experiment or another person completing the experiment without any complaint. In the condition where participants saw another refusing to continue, obedience dropped to 10%. In the condition where participants saw another person completing the experiment without complaint, obedience rose to 90%. Although Milgram explicitly focused on the situational factors that led to greater obedience, these have been found to interact with certain personality characteristics. The more conscientious, that is, orderly and dependable, the more agreeable, that is, cooperative and trusting, and the more authoritarian, that is, in favor of strict obedience, a person is, the more likely they are to obey. Conversely, the more advanced a person's moral reasoning and the higher their social intelligence, that is, the more aware of what is going on around them, the less likely they are to be obedient.